Here we are, day 3 of CES in the afternoon. Perfect time for maximum energy, and I can't imagine anyone is tired, but there is good coffee. I'm James Kugler. Today we'll be talking about from data to ethics and looking at the future of digital trust. And before I bring up some great folks, I just want to remind everyone, we are EMD Electronics, so we're at the heart of everything that we see here at CES. We're a leading supplier of the materials for the electronics industry. We're in every critical step of wafer processing, and we have the broadest portfolio in the industry. But we're also part of something bigger. We're part of Merck, KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. And in the US, we operate under our 3 business names: Millipore Sigma, which is a leading supplier for life sciences, EMD Serono, which is a pharmaceutical company, and EMD Electronics, which is here. One fun fact that you may not have gotten from the earlier ones: in May of 1851, Emanuel Merck actually put the first quality guarantee on a bottle of reagents, which sounds simple, but it was actually very radical. It was the first time you knew this thing was actually this thing. And I view this as really critical today, because if we go back from 1983 to now, average bandwidth has increased about 50% a year, every year. We also had the cost of transmitting information plummet, so 92% drop from 2008 to 2018. And with that, we had huge adoption. So basically, information distribution became incredibly fast and incredibly cheap. It was wave 1. Wave 2 is this explosion of information creation, largely driven by eyeball economics in the early 2010s, so online advertising. And suddenly, putting information available publicly for free could be monetized via ads. And this created a huge boom in the amount of content that was created and consumed and disseminated globally. And we can see the rise of online advertising revenue matching this rise in the information that was created, captured, copied, and transmitted. This inevitably led to an incredible amount of noise. And while humanity was worrying about planet Nibiru and other interesting news stories during this period, crashing into Earth, something magical happened. Moore's Law continued to tick along. Computational capacity increased. The GPU computational performance per dollar increased in this very constant way. And when we combined this incredible amount of information with the increase in compute power, we basically gave rise to large language models as we get 2017 transformer architecture coming out. And this kind of forecast and this growth of information creation assumed that we had some constraint on information creation, that humans had to create it. But we're now at this point where essentially we have the ability to instantaneously and freely distribute content and create content infinitely. And this creates 2 interesting problems. We have the first, which is the curse of recursion. So essentially, if we train models on outputs of models, you inevitably lead to model collapse. The second is this curse of reflection, that if we didn't like what we were seeing before in the 2010s, we're going to essentially have a funhouse effect of content. And I believe this creates this need for a third wave of information curation, that humans are critical for filtering signal from just exploding amounts of noise. And when we look at this, this curation is going to require transparency and the ability to take something from a data point and trace it all the way back to its source system and verify those sources. Additionally, we need mechanisms of correction so that when something goes wrong, we're able to propagate this back and adjust it and fix it. And this gets us back to the quality guarantee in 1851. We believe that we're uniquely positioned to be able to do this. And we do this via the EMD digital businesses, Syntropy, which is focused on bringing data together for the healthcare sector, Athinia, which is doing the same for the semiconductor industry, and M-Trust, which is essentially creating the immutable linkage of any physical object to its digital representation. So with that, I'd like to invite some great colleagues onto the stage here. We have Adam Schafer, who's the CEO of Athinia. We have Justin Wildsmith, who's the Vice President of Commercial for Syntropy, and Jason Laramie, who's Head of Data Sciences for R&D in healthcare. Thank you, guys. All right, sit wherever you want. All righty, gentlemen.
Thank you.
It's good to be here with you. This will be a fun conversation. Let's start with probably doing 2 questions to just like everyone, and we'll get the ball rolling and then have more fun. Get it from there. Can you explain the relevance of data ethics and trust in your industries and projects? And we'll just go right in order here, Adam.
Okay. Thanks, James. So when you talk about the importance of data and data trust, we'll talk about different forms of data and different reasons why it's important. The analogy I used earlier with Justin was saying, we can use the same hammer with very different kinds of nails. And the Athinia focus is on the semiconductor manufacturing industry. So if we look at the value chain across whether it's materials, equipment, fabs, environmental, all the way up into products to make the most complicated products that you just referenced here the world's ever known, these details matter. And when every detail matters and you have really precious family jewel IP, you have a conflict there where you cannot trust and share. So we're really kind of trying to enable one term of art is a zero trust environment, so you can actually collaborate without trust, which is what our system really enables companies to do with their suppliers and with their customers.
Thanks, Adam. So we're in a slightly different industry in Syntropy, right? So we're focused on the healthcare industry, from healthcare innovators like our colleagues here in pharma, all the way through clinical care, clinical delivery. And I think that for us, trust is not an abstract fact here, right? We actually are talking about data that governs whether someone lives or dies, makes physicians and patients comfortable with the decisions that they're making for care. And so one of the reasons I really like CES, my first time here, is it actually reminds me just how quickly we're developing all these digital healthcare technologies. And we face this challenge from all this quick development, and that is these wonderful innovations don't necessarily talk to one another. And I wish that was the full extent of our challenge. Our challenge is also that the data is massively distributed across an ecosystem. And that's, again, a pretty easy thing to solve. But the matrix of those 2 problems and the fact that moving data across the ecosystem to create valuable decision-grade clinical information, you actually face a degradation problem as well. And that's the third one that we try and solve at Syntropy. Degradation meaning every time you move data into a different common data model, you can truncate it and actually lose context. These are really bad problems because at the end of the day, it means your doctor may be making decisions that are not based on the full representation of your health. So I'm reminded of my favorite Reith lecturer. You're going to like this one. Dr. Atul Gawande, about a decade ago, gave a lecture around why doctors fail. That was his title, not mine. And 2 of them, I think, are instructive in healthcare for us. One was ineptitude. Ineptitude is where he defines it: we fail to deploy information that actually exists. And the other one's just simple ignorance, right? Sometimes we don't know things. What we do at Syntropy is try and create durable data, decision-grade data across the ecosystem to solve both of those problems. Maybe we can talk more about that later.
Thank you very much. And so in healthcare, specifically in drug development, data is at the heart of all the decisions that we make to bring a drug from research into humans. And without trust in that data, and trust comes in 2 layers. Do we trust the instruments that were used, that data for the patient and what we received? And did we trust that the data coming from the patient clinical sites into our systems and how we deal with it, is it accurate, is it correct, so that we make decisions to move those drugs from research into humans? And if we can't trust that data when we make bad decisions, we can actually hurt people. Or, especially in like oncology trials where the time is very short that those patients have, bringing a drug to a clinical trial and putting them on that where we know it's not going to be efficacious is also damaging to them. And so we spend a lot of time, James showed sort of a decision tree of that trust. We have a lot of people in each of those steps verifying data over and over again to make sure that we think that that's accurate. And then when we merge that data with external information, it requires a lot of effort to make sure that those experiments are run correctly. We know the metadata around it, and can we use those insights into making our decisions? And so we spend an enormous amount of time trying to understand and validate the data that we're using and the analysis that we do.
There's something uniquely like human about that, right? And you mentioned you have lots of people throughout that process. What is that unique kind of role of human that is there and the necessity of it in your mind?
Yeah, so the uniqueness of the human is to look at whether the data that we receive from the clinical sites matches the other electronic forms that we received. Can we reconcile that? There hasn't been yet an AI system that can do that accurately, and so we still have 30, 40, 50 years of processes put in place to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible. It could be double-blind entry. It can be how do you clean the data? How do you create a database lock that allows us to actually analyze the data? There's so many people in that chain today, and replacing that chain with an AI forward-looking space is, I think, where the future is heading, but we're not there yet.
Justin, Adam, again, same piece. Like, how do you view your approach in tackling the trust challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think to build on what was just said here, I think, one of the assumptions when you think about trust is I trust you, so I'll share my secrets, you share your secrets with me, really kind of undersells not just what I talked about before about can you trust each other, but also what is the data structure? And having that data structured in a way that allows for AI or machine learning types inquiry, so you can see that there are impacts and effects that are much more subtle that maybe didn't matter with a 48 or 24, 22 nanometer product that now does matter with a sub 5 nanometer product or a sub 2 nanometer product. And those yield effects are what keeps that Moore's Law path going. And so it's being able to not just trust each other and share that data, but provide that data structure or that interpretation layer between so that they can communicate. And in the case of a semiconductor device, you're talking about communicating with potentially thousands of materials, hundreds of suppliers, hundreds of pieces of equipment on down the line, and then aligning that with restrictive design rules. So you have a lot of interpretation that happens. Humans have been doing it pretty successfully for 50 years, and they need help.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way I think about trust building in sort of the healthcare industry generally probably is a mixture of people and technology, and there's probably 4 cornerstones that we talk about most with our clients. First, let's just be super philosophical. Trust is built when you can verify truth. And when I mean truth, like, is the data true in the truest sense, right? Complete, does context exist, et cetera. We build that within Syntropy by bringing clear provenance to the data, making sure that you can see a lineage of how that data may have transformed from its acquisition to the decision point. Let's keep in mind, I mentioned this ecosystem's huge. The data is moving all the time, and you need to be able to see how it's transformed in order to assure that there is trust. So, there's that sort of verified truth piece. The second piece is really around data rights. We spend a lot of time thinking about data rights within healthcare, and the example I would give you is really the patient's right to understand how, where, and when their data is being used. Keep in mind, what we're all trying to build here in the healthcare system is a learning, data-based healthcare system to enable precision medicine. And without patients consenting to their data, that just simply can't exist. So we spend a lot of time with our clients. They agree with us that patient consent is a critical cornerstone of building this trust. We do that by creating durable, computable consent that attaches to the data, moves with the data, and actually enforces purpose-based controls and allows audits. So, right, we had, is it true? We have patient consent. I think you have to talk about the environment. you can only imagine the troubles that come from taking sensitive patient data and like forcing it out into the wild. It's really critical that we have, hardened environments in which this can all occur. What we do in that space is we create these trusted research environments where you can actually bring your computation, you can bring your question to the data, rather than, again, sending that data out into the wild, which is super risky. The fourth one I don't normally like to talk about without my attorney sitting next to me, but it's liability, right? Let's be honest, there's massive liabilities at stake here. And I'll give you an ought statement. Sensitive patient data ought not to be spread around a bunch of homegrown bespoke systems that are governed maybe by the home team. I would rather see this sensitive data in hardened, well-governed systems like Palantir.
Yeah, let's double click on the liability portion of it. Like how do you view the liability and the lack of kind of insurance product, so to speak, for healthcare as a barrier for being able to really use the information that is there that you could use in a legal and ethical and compliant way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd love to hear what Jason has to say about it, but I think we sit in a space where the sort of bells go off with our clients when we start showing them the reduction in liability when they actually do use purpose-built hardened systems. And so I'm going to make an assumption that a lot of that work's happening at high liability, and the change that we're trying to see in the sort of incentive alignment is just reducing that overall liability burden. But it might be different in the pharma space.
Yeah, so liability for us is a huge deal because of the sensitive nature of the data that we deal with, that we are under the guidance of GDPR, and any violation of that is actually a huge fine based on the revenues of the company, and so we take that very seriously. What we do work internally on is how do we do risk-based queries against that data so that you're not always going to the lowest common denominator around what is the risk for doing something. You can modify that risk a little bit to ask a certain kind of question when you need to, so that you can loosen that up a bit than just having lawyers say no all the time. We can't do that, and you just lock the data away.
I mean, what do you view as kind of the thing that is going to be necessary to really unlock the overall value of healthcare data for pharma R&D? Because the opportunity is there, the necessity is there. There are obviously a lot of challenges through it, but what do you think is the key towards unlocking this?
I think open-mindedness is one of the bigger ones. In multiple companies have talked about this risk-based access to data, and it takes years to get people to understand that it's okay to trust the employees, the analysts, to ask the right questions of the data, and not to think that they're immediately going to jump and start to identify patients and do that kind of stuff. And so it starts with trust of the employees, but the risk-based part of it, once they see it in operation, that it still protects the patient, but we get much more richer information from that, is the way to open that up. And I think the other side of that is the pharmaceutical companies to collaborate with each other and start sharing the right information with each other for the benefit of the patient overall. And so I think if you do those three things, and you need all of them in order to even be able to share data out, you need to have this risk-based stuff internally. You need to have people thinking a little bit more open-minded about the data.
It reminds me, going back to Adam, your point earlier, you also have to trust the other party, right? And so you have this clear cultural component that's there. There's clearly a technical component of it. If you go back to kind of your thoughts on how you get this culture kind of going.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of it's not only just the data challenge that we're talking about and the trust challenge, but it's getting everyone to say yes at the same time. And that's really, really hard. That's why we're working so hard at making this happen. If it were easy, then we could just apply the technology to it and solve the hard problems. But getting everyone to say yes at the same time and having an understanding of what is an important risk to a business risk, a privacy risk, a liability risk, et cetera. I think it applies the same thing in semiconductors as well. And then once you have that, well, I think there's some good news too, right? Not everything if you think about the idea of a digital twin, and if you want to call it a digital twin or just a model, doesn't matter, but it doesn't have to be complete to be useful. And so having what I would call a low resolution digital twin can still be quite useful, and then you can say, hey, there's more and more fidelity to be added over time to make it more and more powerful. So you could have a cooperation between, say, a semiconductor manufacturer and their facilities and equipment, and bring in the material details as they become relevant to where the problem is. And to Justin's point there, having that ontology or combined data set allows you to interrogate that to drive today's hardest problems, or maybe tomorrow's quality problems, or yesterday's R&D problems. So it's having this growing, learning, and very powerful data set that brings that together, that can continue to grow and expand. You don't need to restart the model every time you ask it a question.
I like that perspective. Let me add a couple of things from the Syntropy side. At CES, I've been getting a lot of questions around, can you define what the technology problem is? What's the tech problem so we can solve it, right? We're surrounded by all these technology innovators. It's a great question to ask. Let me just be honest, I'm in a very unique situation. I have a joint venture with Palantir Technologies. I spend less than 1% of my time thinking about technology problems. Those are all handled. Instead, I've been relying on the strategic and the incentive alignment problems that we face. And I'll give you two examples just to add to what these guys have said. The first is this ubiquitous sense I get across institutes that everything needs to be built for purpose or built yourself, this sort of DIY mentality. And James, you know I change my oil on the weekends. I'm a DIYer. But I think DIY in this context is actually holding back innovation. It's pausing us, right? And so this is kind of one of those things that wakes me up at night. You know, I think of this Nobel laureate that's about to, save humanity. And instead of in the lab finalizing things, he's in his office trying to recreate PowerPoint when the heart attack takes him from us, right? Let's stand on the shoulders of giants. The systems already exist, and accelerate the clinical discovery in that way. The other example I've been noticing more since about 2024 it's more around how we handle the semantics piece, right? The semantic and syntactic interoperability challenge that I mentioned at the outset. And I seem to sense this kind of zeitgeist that institutes and especially now regulators, it's not ubiquitous, but some regulators seem to think the solution to that is some sort of carved in stone gold standard for the data to which all future data must apply. And James, I mean, you're joined here by three scientists, you're a scientist yourself, all different disciplines, but I think we're all very quickly going to recognize that there's data available in January of 26 this month that wasn't available, data types that weren't available mid-year last year, right? Science advances so quickly. And so what we're trying to change regulators' opinions to adopt is this sort of living ontology that you mentioned, right? A Rosetta Stone that allows the data of yesterday to be joined with the data of tomorrow at the speed of science. So that's the only two things I would add there.
I like that a lot. I'm thinking, I love that this is your first time at CES also for both of you. And I'm really curious your thoughts on this, and especially, if we look at the booth next to us here, it's a robot for kids, right? That you bring in, and it has some cameras on it, and you give it to your kid, and it reads books to them. And nothing like giving just a camera going somewhere just to have with your children all the time. There's a very different concept of privacy and just how information is handled in the consumer side. What is it like for you guys walking around and seeing some of these differences? And are there elements also that probably industry shouldn't be as worried about or should be more aggressive on when you see the pace that is happening here?
Yeah, I can go first on that one. This is my first CES. It's quite overwhelming. I'm used to going to academic conferences, and so one of the things that I saw was really interesting in thinking back to how do we run clinical trials, and you have a robot over here, is that the more that we can do in a patient's home, the faster that trial can run, the less burden on the patient. But I always think, like, where's the data going? And I know I've spent years with companies that have devices and things, and like, what does the cloud structure look like, and how private is it, and how do we get it back into our infrastructure? And so some of the stuff around here worries me of like, where's the data ending up, and how where does it end up, but then could we actually use it in a regulatory setting?
Yes, I am a CES first-timer. What I'm taking away from my first couple of days here is, I guess I would say, the potential that exists for patient-reported outcomes that hadn't existed in the past, using wearables, using robotics, to really get a sense of disease progression, to really get a sense of what's happening at home, to really even use digital biomarkers. I haven't seen a ton of that here yet. The second that I would point out is there are a lot of researchers doing similar things, yet not joined quite together. Right? It's very difficult for collaborators in Korea to necessarily collaborate on their data with Singapore even. And I think that in the context of precision medicine, rare disease, childhood oncology, really one of the tech challenges that does still exist that we solve for is bringing data sets together when the data is insufficient in one locale. So.
This is my second time at CES, but I've been in the semi industry for a long time, and I just realized the 8th of January 2001 was a Monday, which was actually my first day at Intel, and so that was my first day in a semiconductor fab. And when coming to CES and thinking about those fundamental building blocks and what's happened in the last 25 years, and how hard it was to make those devices, and how easy that seems today compared to the challenge that we have today, is, to me, that's the kind of the stark contrast. And when we look at some of the things that EMD Electronics is enabling with NVIDIA and other partners and up through that whole value chain, it is overwhelming, but it's built on this foundation of technology, and we're essentially cashing those checks we've been writing for decades.
I'm curious, Adam, when you look at where we are now, too, where every single information point can then turn into a generative kind of bit of inference that generates infinitely more content on top of it, do you have any sense of, or what's your kind of gut feeling in terms of where memory is going to be going and what that demand will look like for the next 5-10 years or so?
That's a really interesting question, because memory specifically has been, it was the driver of the industry in the 90s, and in the 2000s it really became very commoditized. And so these charts of memory prices have really driven materials and other semiconductor volumes globally. And logic was the sexy stuff that actually made things happen, but volume-wise much lower. And in the last 3 years, with high bandwidth memory, you had this bifurcation. So the price for memory no longer had that foundational impact that it did, because you had this very expensive enabling memory and you had the commodity memory. I think now we're seeing this much more of that steady growth, both in the HBM and in the traditional memory, as we're getting these multiple high 3D stacked devices, which are very extremely complicated to produce. And you have the 3 leading companies in Korea and the US that are doing really an incredible job and building kind of the same stuff. And we're in a very healthy point of competition as they're each taking the lead in some of these niche applications. So I'm very excited about what memory brings and what it does for the industry. And the integration, you can see in that example right there, the integration into every device it's not going anywhere. It's getting even more dependent.
And as we look at the kind of push for more performance sooner, I mean, when you have Jensen pushing Moore's Law is dead and then continuously managing to kind of have the time to bring new things to market, we've reached a bit of a plateau on that. But as folks keep pushing to bring the next generation out, are you seeing it harder to get folks collaborating together in new ways or trusting each other with each other's information sets, or easier, or is it kind of the same? Or
I don't know if I would say it's harder, but who is in the driver's seat to be able to make those demands has shifted, right? Instead of being from the integrated device maker of 10 years ago, now it's to the fabless integrator of that's driving the larger devices. The economics. So you showed interesting graphs there because they all look like Moore's law, but you could say it's bit density. You could say it's economics. It's whatever it is. It all has the same kind of shape. And I think now you're seeing that continue to grow, but the drivers are different. And right now the drivers are these extremely high cost, high value, large die, which puts more emphasis on yield devices that are separated again from where the day-to-day consumer driver is. So I still think that it's there. The driver is different, and that cooperation needs to happen between those leading entities. So you're going to have those memory device makers really being part of that integrated ecosystem that like NVIDIA is driving.
Yeah. Fascinating. In 3 years, and I'll start with you, Jason, on this one, and then I'm also curious your thoughts, Justin, as well. But in 3 years, what do you think we're going to be laughing about from the kind of like our discussion now on data trust and the kind of the complexities around especially healthcare information flows, and what do you think we're going to be more worried about? So what are we going to be laughing about that we were worried about it then, and what will we then be worried about?
I think what we'll be laughing about a little bit is I mentioned all the people in the process, that I think those handoffs themselves create errors within the system, and I think that in the next 2-3 years, those people will be doing something slightly different, maybe more, maybe a little bit more different than what they're used to, but it won't be cutting and pasting and making sure that the check boxes and these things. I think we'll look back and say, I can't believe we had so many people in that process. I think the other side of that is around the models that are now starting to come out, especially the biological ones, is how do we validate those, and are they giving us correct answers? And that's been a challenge, and I think it still remains a challenge. I think we're very data sparse in how we build the models, and how do you get enough data to feel confident in the models that we're thinking about, so that we can potentially, as Laura had said before, reduce animal testing and these kinds of things. What do you actually need to do that to convince the health authorities that say we will accept that piece of evidence versus running a new trial or running a new experiment?
Yeah, very similarly, I think to Jason's point, we spend a lot of time and effort, thousands of FTEs, trying to validate what we know automated systems can output today, because we're worried that, okay, maybe the AI is going to hallucinate and someone's life is at stake. I think we're going to laugh at that as the years go by. Maybe 3 years out is probably the right time scale. I think we are going, however, to be worried about something I heard yesterday in one of the digital healthcare talks. The shift from, you were monetizing eyeballs, remember, on your slide, to monetizing attachment. Has nothing to do with Syntropy, but I'm going to be worried, I think, about how we monetize attachment. I have a young child at home. That's why I worry about it.
That's great. What about you, Adam?
I think, again, when I think about my world, the semiconductor world, I don't think it's ever it's probably as prominent and people understand it better than they ever have. But it's never going, we're at the Consumer Electronics Show, it's never going to be the blinking screen or the robot itself. It's going to really be the heart and the brain behind that. So when you ask, what are we going to laugh about, I think the idea of having this much work to get to work is going to be the difference. We're going to have more of a unified data structure that we can continue to interrogate from, and it's going to work better. It works better than it ever did, and it's going to. And this is, I think, to quote John from yesterday, this is as bad as it's ever going to be. It's only going to get better. It's going to get more efficient, and it's going to get more cost effective. And that's where we are. That's the inflection point where I see us being.
I mean, the pace is very radical right now. And I think some of the biggest things in the biology side are probably going to be coming about when we can take kind of the remarkable scale that SEMI operates at and that kind of rigor, and are able to apply it to data generation across all domains of biology, so that you can get trustworthy enough data at enough of a scale that we can train these validated models that really make them useful. And my hope is that we start kind of applying that rigor to it, because it's brutal. It's a lot of work, but simultaneously, I like seeing events like this where the numbers of participants are growing tremendously. There's a side where when you're in the uncanny valley of like, do I know if something is real or not real? People tend to spend more time with people in real life and making those types of attachments and engagements, which is fantastic. Thank you all so much for being up here. If anyone has any questions, they'll be hanging around after. We'll all be hanging around here after, so I highly encourage you to come and talk to us, and want to thank you all very much. So thanks again, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.